quick word about the parsha this week, and it's a really it's a beautiful parsha. It talks about the Jubilee year, which is sort of a reset button on debts and on the crops, and it talks about how when we come into the land of Israel, we can't take the first fruits. We can't get them. They're not our fruits to take, and we have to wait. And then there are other years where there's fruit and produce that we can't take, and we have to let the land rejuvenate itself. And so it's a really beautiful and rich parsha. Of course, parsha is not a parsha without some conflict, though. You know, one of the things that's amazing about this parsha is it goes into the laws around slavery. And it's really deep. I mean, it's easy to say, you know, laws around slavery. However, at that time period, slavery was very common. And hundreds of years after that time, you have one of the greatest thinkers in the history of mankind, Aristotle, who puts up a justification for slavery. And he basically says, you know, some people are better, some people are worse. Some people, by their very nature, deserve to be slaves. Some people, by their very nature, deserve to be masters, right? So, both in all of the tribal cultures, and then even in Greece, you have slavery happening as part of society, okay? And in Judaism, we have in this parsha an understanding that people are people and people aren't property. They're not property. You can't own somebody forever, by and large, okay? There is, however, a little bit of a conflict. It says that amongst fellow Jews, but when they go to talk about people from foreign nations, it's a little bit different. And so the question that the rabbis wrestle with tremendously, and it's a great question, is how could the Jews be slaves in Egypt? And how can God tell us how to treat slaves? Why not just abolish slavery? And the rabbis for years, you know, commentary after commentary are wrestling with this issue. You know, and it makes sense. So, okay, you've got this great step. You know, you've got this great step of you don't enslave your fellow Jew forever, and you've got this great step where you have all of these nice rules and regulations about how to make slavery nicer. But why not just abolish it, right? It's something that people wrestle with tremendously. So one of the most famous answers is from Rabbi Maimonides, the Rambam. And the Rambam basically says, you can't force a people to change beyond their continuity. So, i.e., the Jews at that time, the Israelites at that time, and in their culture were used to slavery. And you can't just say, no more slavery. You have to meet people where they're at and slowly help them trend or lead them off into a different direction. And for me, you know, I basically read as what I would consider, you know, secular spiritualists, right? I didn't grow up steeped in Maimonides or anything like that. And I seem like, okay, this is like a clever idea, but I always feel like, you know, I'm being swindled, like it's an obfuscation, you know. But then I started to think about it a lot deeper. People appreciate Rambam, so I give it, you know, 2 or 3 reads. And as I was reading it, I started thinking about it, and I started thinking about the biggest example of freedom in the 5 books of Moses and Torah. And the biggest example of freedom is obviously the Exodus from Egypt. And I was thinking, wow, but you know what? There really is no freedom in the ideal sense, in the abstract sense, right? The freedom that we know in Torah is the concrete freedom of the people one day at a time, moving from slavery to liberation to freedom. And it is always contextualized. And so from that point of view, I really got it. Rambam was saying, hey, look, you can have your ideas of freedom, or we could in our society have our ideas of freedom, but here's what's happening out in the world. You know, what does that really look like in the world? What does that look like in the hearts of men and women? What does that look like in our organizations and in our businesses and our sweatshops? What does that reality look like? Okay. And so I appreciated that, and as I was mulling it over, what came to me is that in Torah it goes this far, and what the freedom is in Torah, in this parsha, is it's an imperfect and incomplete freedom. It's freedom, it's moving towards that principle of freedom, but it's incomplete and it's imperfect. And it got me to thinking about our principles. We say tzedek, which is righteousness. And I think about righteousness in the world, and righteousness is imperfect and incomplete, right? I think about shalom, which we translate often as peace, but maybe better understood as wholeness, which is ironic, because when we think about peace in this world, it's imperfect and incomplete, very imperfect in this world and very incomplete. And I started to realize that we have all of these ideas of truth, of freedom, of righteousness, justice, compassion. And I realized that in this world, all of these principles are incomplete. And I sort of pictured them in my mind, these ideal forms, these orbs, but down here they're sort of cracked and broken. It's Kabbalistic idea. And what I started to recognize is that we have all of those qualities, all of those principles in us. We wrestle with them as people every day. We wrestle with being transparent or being truthful. We wrestle with being just. We wrestle for both personal and political and popular freedom. We wrestle with all of those, but they're imperfect and incomplete. And what hit me so profound is that, of course, they're imperfect and incomplete because our job is to constantly move towards bringing them to wholeness. Constantly move towards bringing the incompleteness and the imperfection of the world towards more wholeness. And this one is a little bit of a side note and a little bit strange, but because I was thinking about all of these concepts, I was thinking, well, what would it be like, perfect freedom? Perfect freedom, what does that feel like? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? What's the experience of perfect freedom or perfect truth or perfect justice or perfect shalom, perfect peace and perfect wholeness? And I realized that once they're all perfect, they're not different from one another. There's no difference between perfect truth and perfect freedom. Really try to imagine it. They're the same thing. There's no difference between perfect peace and perfect freedom. And I was thinking, if you put all of those together and you held them in your hand and you said, let me show you this. I was thinking, what would you call all of that? All of that perfection. And I was thinking, you wouldn't call it anything. You wouldn't dare want to say the word. You would just probably call it the name, like Hashem, right? You would think Hashem, right? And so what I saw was that God is working with us, right? Working with us to complete the imperfection and the incompleteness of this world. Shabbat shalom, everybody.